Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, for the first time in 3 years, the U.S. engaged in a high-level discussion with Russia today. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting with his Russian counterpart to explore a possible end to the war in Ukraine. Russia began the war with its illegal invasion of the country, so the talks have unsettled European leaders, in large part because America's traditional allies were not invited to take part in talks, and even Ukraine was sidelined, with President Volodymyr Zelensky saying decisions about his country cannot be made behind Ukraine's back. Still, this is what we heard from Secretary Rubio in Riyadh, where the meeting took place.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war. Whether we can ultimately reach that outcome will obviously depend on every side in this conflict's willingness to agree to certain things.
Now, the U.S. administration went on to downplay Ukraine's absence from today's meeting, saying there will be more inclusive talks down the road. But for some reaction today, we did sit down with Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Yuliya Kovaliv, and here is just a part of our discussion. So as you and I sit down for this conversation, the talks in Riyadh have wrapped up, and at the table were representatives of the United States, of Russia, not Ukraine, not any other European country. How does Kyiv view these talks in Riyadh?
I think, Ukraine is very clear from the very beginning that, first of all, we as Ukrainians want to have peace as nobody else. That is up to Russia to end the war by, taking their troops out of Ukraine's sovereign territory. But also, if we look on the peace in Ukraine, the key component of this peace is this peace to make just and lasting. And that's why the conversations needs to include Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, because what Russia launched back almost 3 years ago, the full-scale invasion into the sovereign, independent, democratic country, is also the huge threat and the biggest conventional war in the European continent since the Second World War. So today, Ukrainian men and women in the uniform are protecting eastern flank of Europe and the whole Europe. So it's also a part of the European security, and we believe that Europe needs to be also a part of the negotiations.
So Ukraine needs to be at the table, Europe needs to be at the table, as you say, although when we hear U.S. state officials describe this meeting, they see it almost as a test, if you will, to see if there is the potential for more meaningful negotiations between the U.S. and Russia on several matters, including Ukraine. Is that a hopeful or a concerning statement to hear?
Look, we see the reality on the ground, and we see what Putin is doing. If we look on Russian military machine, this year, Russian war budget is increasing 25% in comparison to the last year. Russia continues to conscript new soldiers, and this year they will increase their army for additional 150,000 of troops. So today Russia is, building and continue to build their war machine. And as from the very first day, said Russia can stop this war today if they want. But from what we are seeing, Russia continues not only to build their military capability, not only to increase their army, but they are continuing with the attacks on Ukraine. But we learned it from the history. There are many cases where Russia was directly lying. First, it was Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine had the third biggest stock of nuclear weapons in the world. We refused from that. But also we got so-called guarantees. They just left on the paper because Russia was one of the guarantors for territorial integrity, for sovereignty of Ukraine, which remained a piece of paper. Then we had Minsk I, then we had Minsk II. We had already in our history different types of negotiations on the high level, Normandy format. actually Russia breached everything from that time. And now, like learning from these lessons of the history, there is a way to provide the security guarantees. Without them, this peace won't be sustainable, because Russia does not demonstrate the willingness for stopping the war.
Okay, and so as you say, there is a history of Ukraine making concessions, thinking that in making those concessions, Ukraine would have territorial integrity guaranteed from countries including Russia. But here you now have a U.S. administration, Donald Trump, even before elected, saying that he wanted to see an end to the war. Are you afraid that whole history is lost on the U.S. president?
I think, U.S., as President Trump said, and there was a meeting between President Zelensky and Vice President Vance in Ukraine. There will be the visit in the coming days, actually this week, of the special envoy, General Kellogg, to Kyiv. We share, the idea and the desire for peace, and just and lasting peace. But that is the way and how to achieve this peace, and how to achieve the way that this peace will be sustainable. And there are actually quite a straightforward way. It's actually Ukraine becoming a NATO member. This is what Ukraine was desiring for many years. But what changed since the start of the full-scale invasion is actually that today, first, Ukraine has one of the strongest armies in the European continent, one of the biggest army, which has the capacity to be cooperative with all the other NATO forces, because we are using NATO standard weapons. Many of thousands of our troops have been trained in NATO standards. Actually, in Canada, highly contributed to that. And this is not only the kind of an easiest way to ensure this just and lasting peace, but pragmatically saying, it is the cheapest way to do it. Because what is the other alternative? The other alternative is to build in Ukraine the deterrence capabilities, which is strong army, which is presence of European and US and other allied troops in Ukraine to guarantee the security, building robust defense sector. And this could be also an option, but definitely it will require more resources in comparison to just, inviting Ukraine to become a NATO member.
So I hear the argument you're making that the fastest way to make sure this doesn't happen again is to bring Ukraine into NATO. However, we know that from the Russian president, he says that any end of violence between the two countries must be accompanied by a guarantee that Ukraine is never allowed into NATO. And we have heard U.S. officials essentially say that NATO membership needs to be taken off the table in order for these talks to move forward. So what's your response to that?
I think the first question we need to ask all of ourselves, why Putin has his voice here? Why Putin can dictate the strongest democratic alliance in the world, which is NATO alliance, what to do or what not to do. And I think, understanding that NATO was built as a strong deterrence alliance to deter any of the risk of aggression. And NATO for years had the concept of open door policy. So the question is, why dictator who literally, went through, breached almost every possible international rules and orders, can have a voice to dictate what to do or not what to do. For us, it's Ukraine's desire to become a NATO member. It's backed by Ukrainian people, who in their high majority support that. It is also backed by our constitution, where Ukraine's aspiration to become an EU member and to become a NATO member is clearly stated. And it's also, once again, pragmatically saying, and what President Zelensky said over this weekend in his speech in the Munich Security Conference, that it's a right time to start thinking about the joint European forces, where Ukraine could be a significant contributor to the strengthening of security in Europe.
Which is an idea being floated around. But when you ask the question, how is a Russian dictator allowed to have so much say at the table? It is because the United States is trying to pursue a normalization of relationships with Moscow. So does Ukraine feel abandoned right now as the United States looks at a bigger picture, Ukraine just being a part of it?
Look, Ukraine is fighting the war. Ukraine is protecting, I think, all of us in terms of protecting the, democracy. I think what Ukraine shares the view with the United States that, peace through strength is the way how to achieve it. Because you can't, talk with the dictators and make, like concessions at the beginning with this negotiation. And of course, the President Zelensky made a very clear position that any of the talks behind Ukraine back is acceptable for Ukraine, and that's very clear for us. And I think we
it's
feel
not acceptable for
it's
Ukraine.
not acceptable for us, of course.
I do also have to ask, because another condition for ending the war for Russia, and this is from the Russian president, he says in order for the war to end, Ukraine must recognize Russian-occupied territories in your country. Is Ukraine willing to accept that as a condition to end the war?
How you can imagine it? He brought tanks. First, back in 2014, they brought so-called green men. They occupied Crimea. They occupied part of Donetsk and Luhansk region. Now with Russian tanks, missiles, and troops, not only Russian troops, but also North Korean troops, and with the Iranian drones, they occupied part of Ukrainian territory. Of course, if you look on the bigger picture, strategically Putin lost this war. And we need also to be very clear on that, because we all remember back 3 years ago, what were the expectations of many of our partners and allies? That Kiev will fall down in days, in weeks, and there could be, the reality of Russian troops marching over the parade around March. It never happened. Yes, we sacrificed a lot with the people, with the lives lost, with the huge damages and the huge loss to the country, but we are sovereign, independent, and democratic country. If you ask the question about the territories, how can we live in the world where the borders can be redrawn by a dictator with the military power? In what world then we will end up living? And what will be the lesson learned from other dictators? Do we want to turn this world into the military chaos? And do we want to turn the governments of our countries only focusing on the military spendings, on the defense, because this is the only way to protect the countries? Probably the very obvious question is no.
Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Yuliya Kovaliv. The full interview, we should say, can be seen this weekend in a new episode of Profile that will premiere Saturday, both online and on our cable channel.